David is glad that you are here. Wayne is glad that you are here.
Absolutely.
I just wanted to make one quick announcement. If anybody would anybody ever be interested in registering online and for a pizza and a salad over there across the place some week in October it goes from 6 to 6:45, and I told Carol and Dennis that I would announce this. So if you're interested, go online and register. Okay? So tonight we are very, very privileged to have David Johnson come and share about this wonderful book that he has written. Some of you have very long-lasting associations with this young man.
It's true.
And
It's true.
as always, we're really anxious to have Wayne do the interview. And so if we could just open with a word of prayer, that would be great. Lord God, we do thank you for this absolutely glorious fall day, one more in a line. We thank you for the folks who have gathered to come and open their minds and their hearts as they hear what is inside this writer's mind. We ask that you would bless all the folks who can't be with us this evening, and a special blessing on those who are here. And we ask this in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen.
Thank you, Barb. David, you can sit down or stand. I think the camera will allow us to walk in a little square out here, so we can. All right, we can sit down, but we also can stand up.
You have drones.
The thrones we're waiting for, Don. We're waiting for. Thank you all for coming. This is really going to be fun. You know, whenever you're introducing someone, you hope that some vignette will be put into your lap, and lo and behold, the only thing I really knew about David Johnson was that he had a job that the first two people who told me about it say the job he has is impossible. It's like 2 or 3 jobs put together. So I wrote David about 5 days or 6 days ago. I said, David, look, I want to come down and see where you do your work. I want to just give me 20 minutes. Get 20 minutes, half hour, we'll have coffee. He has a very interesting little run at the end of the book about coffee, about how the church is wrong about some things but right about coffee. Just give me about a half hour in your backwoods, your native habitat, and we'll just have a chat, and then we'll go on Wednesday night. I get this very nicely written email back saying, Wayne, I cannot find a minute. I've got this big public-private partnership coming up. I've got wall-to-wall meetings all day up until tonight. So it confirmed what I knew about him already. He is CEO and president of BioCrossroads. That's where it starts. But I do want to start off, David Johnson, by having you say a little more about what you're doing now, because it's kind of interesting. Here's a preacher's kid. Many of you know he's the son of a preacher man. A lot of Presbyterian preachers in this family. And he's in a very different spot now than he did not follow in his father's footsteps, apparently. It's kind of an interesting way we may learn to talk about that connection. But David, tell us a little bit about your job, about this impossible job.
You want me to define what I do?
Yeah, define what you do, David.
Easy.
Help us.
Because it actually is 2 completely different jobs.
Yeah.
About 15 years ago, the business community here, led by Lilly Endowment, decided that Indianapolis needed a strategy beyond amateur sports. And we had just succeeded in landing the NCAA to move here, and it doesn't get a whole lot better than that when you've stolen a football team successfully from Baltimore and done all the other great things that we did, convinced the National Rowing Association to move here, even though Indianapolis is the largest city in the world that's not on a navigable body of water. You know, and you get the NCAA to come here from Kansas City, and you get Final Fours that people are going to do till the end of time. And you go, it doesn't get any better than that. And all of you here in this church has many and very special relationships with Lilly Endowment and Bill Enright, who's on the endowment board today.
Absolutely.
And Craig Dykstra, who is also on the endowment board and who has been a member here until, unfortunately, he and his wife moved back to North Carolina. But the endowment is very focused, in addition to being focused on religion, it's very focused on the vitality of the community. And they believe that this community really needed a strategy to emphasize education, to emphasize talent, and to take advantage of the things that we had here in a much more deliberate, intentional way. And they formed an organization called the Central Indiana Corporate Partnership. And in a sense, CICP is the flip side of the United Way. The United Way sort of worries about the social safety net, the sustainability of the community, people in need, and they do tremendous work. And frankly, the United Way in this community would be a much smaller organization than it is without the very active support of Lilly Endowment and right in its immediate step, Eli Lilly and Company as well. Yeah. The Central Indiana Corporate Partnership is the other side of that, which is looking at what are the best ways to take the community and really help it grow, not by going outside and finding new companies to move here necessarily or trying to steal someone else's headquarters, but by looking at historically what we're really good at and trying to build more of it, trying to train and educate people to work in the industries that we're really good at, and try to drive more investment to it. And to do that, they set up a really unusual form of organization, the Central Indiana Corporate Partnership, which is a membership organization of the 60 top corporations and research universities in this part of the state. But sitting on top of that corporation is the CICP Foundation, which takes in substantial amounts of philanthropy from the Endowment, Lumina Foundation, a number of other foundations here in town, and puts them to work in massive public-private projects. It's a very interesting organization. It was also put together by a bunch of lawyers, and I am a lawyer. So I got very involved as a volunteer at the time that CICP was put together. And the first thing that organization did was to go out and, of course, what all new organizations do, go out and hire a consultant to tell you what you should be doing.
That's right.
And the consultant came back and said, you need to be really looking at several sectors urgently for much better organization here. You need to look at advanced manufacturing, you need to look at information technology. But when it comes to your life sciences companies, starting with Eli Lilly and Company and Dagra Sciences, and at that time Guidant Corporation, Cook Group, Roche Diagnostics, you have like 5 times as many of those companies here as any place your size anywhere in the United States, and you're not doing anything with it. Everybody knows everybody, but you could have all kinds of new companies and new activity taking place if you put it together. And so organization BioCrossroads was formed under the Central Indiana Corporate Partnership umbrella.
I see.
And again, all of you, serve as volunteers on committees. When you are a lawyer and you are a finance lawyer, you always get put on the money committee, right? Always. And so when BioCrossroads was organized, it had identified several needs, and one of the biggest ones was to raise a big venture capital fund, which I helped do as a volunteer. And ultimately, coming out of it, all that ended up being persuaded to go lead the organization, which I happily did for 7 years until the guy running the Central Indiana Corporate Partnership, Mark Miles, got persuaded by the Holman family to come run the Indianapolis Motor Speedway. And the executive committee at CICP decided that this organization was so complicated that basically someone who already understood it would probably be the best person to run it.
Absolutely.
And so I ended up being asked to do that as well. And so
And you said yes at that point.
I said yes. I said yes at that point.
Explain yourself there, David.
I knew I wasn't going to go back to being a practicing lawyer, so why not? Go ahead and do that. So that's what I do now, and it is interesting. It's a privilege of a job. I really thoroughly enjoy it. And there are some days I'm better at it than others. I have 2 offices, so if you'd come to meet me, I could have taken you to one of 2 completely different buildings. I could have introduced you to completely different staffs, and we'll do that. That'd be a good thing to do. It's a longer answer than you want, but one thing that's pertinent to the book, and I think important for all of us to recognize in life, I was a decent lawyer. I had a pretty decent practice. I was pretty self-confident in what I was doing. And when I was in my early 50s, was asked to do the BioCrossroads job, and it was just like diving into the very deep end of a very cold pool. I instantly went from being the person who knew the most in any meeting to being the dumbest person in any meeting, knowing nothing about the science and really knowing very little about the investments or anything else that were involved in the sector, and very little even about the businesses I was working with. And so it was a humbling experience to me, remains a humbling experience actually, and one with a continuing learning curve, and brought me into contact with many, many, many very extremely smart scientists at the IU School of Medicine, at Purdue, the research teams at Eli Lilly and Company and elsewhere, which really frankly has some of the finest research scientists around. They just all happen to work in a company.
Yeah.
And so the discussions of science from a lay perspective and understanding, because we have investment funds, so we invest in startup companies that these scientists produce.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
I had to be able to understand enough of what they did to be able to make a decision of whether to invest in them or not. And that had a lot to do with getting me into thinking about some of the issues historically identified between science and religion and some of the other things that you probably want to talk about.
You bet, you bet. Did you have, back at Harvard, back in your educational, did you have some background in the sciences, or is this really?
Absolutely none.
None.
No.
Perfectly prepared
No.
for BioCrossroads.
Beth would know this well because has known my parents very well. I am a very pragmatic Calvinist, so I am of the school that basically you go and you work where you're useful.
Sure.
The life sciences and healthcare assets that we have in this community are off the charts in terms of their significance. They really are. And now, fortunately, we have data that proves that. So to me, it was like, what could be more interesting than getting involved in that and seeing if we could make some deals happen? No, it was purely the business side of it that interested me. But you have to know something about the science, too. That's the part they didn't tell me when I took the
Oh, dear. Well, they saw something in you that maybe was unnamed, that you weren't a specialist in any of the departments, but you could run all of them, which is kind of a nice.
That's very kind of you, Wayne, but the truth is my core skill is raising money. If there's one thing I can actually do, that is it. And so that's what all these organizations.
Have you been unclipped here?
Did I turn something off? Okay. Oh, yeah, I did. Sorry about that.
Just want to make sure we hear you right.
Clipped in here. Yeah.
Now we know a little bit about what David does. I want to talk about the book now. The book is really very good. It is so good that those of you who haven't read it yet, you can certainly read mine, but you're going to have to give it back. David brought a couple of copies here, so there are a few copies that you can pick up from Deb. I'll bet he'll sign them on the way out. One way you know that a book is good is to follow the publisher's lead. They get testimonials for a book. Once they decide to publish, they will then advertise it by picking out some people who they think will be impressive to you when you look at the outside of this book without opening to page one. And I must say that it's very difficult to look at the cover of this book and not be interested enough to go inside it. On the front is a commendation testimonial from Walter Isaacson, who probably in English is one of the finest and best known biographers around. He did Steve Jobs and some other biographers. On the back, Mitch Daniels, you know him. There's a nice line here that I want to repeat to you. There's a saying, when an old person dies, and this book begins with the story of David's father's death and what that means and how it put a stamp on his life in Dave's memory. It's just a beautiful chapter. But what a great saying. When an old person dies, a library closes. And then Daniel's continues. This book opens a rich library in which the reader will want to browse often. So it's a nice testament and description of what David has done here. Krista Tippett of On Being says some good things about the book. E.J. Tion, the columnist. I mean, there are people here that will draw your attention to the book. It is just a very good book, so don't miss the opportunity to read it. Now, David, tell us a little bit about how it came to be. We know it's letters from your father. That's the core of it, but I know there were some other people involved in getting it to the publication stage. When did the idea first strike you, and how did it come to birth?
Well, the idea first struck me 42 years ago, actually, when we really did do the exchange. There was another set of letters that you don't see in this book, because I'm a merciful person, and those are the letters that I wrote back.
Oh, I see.
And they are the letters of an 18, 19, and 20-year-old, and they it's funny, those don't stand the test of time real well. He and I did, I mean, it was a genuine exchange of letters. We called it the Honest Exchange. We completed it. That was a time when sort of the whole, right following all the waves of protest on the Vietnam War. There was a lot of interest in sort of younger voices. And we got actually pretty far with Harper & Row and a couple of other publishers in trying to get it published, and came very close to it. And in fact, so close to it that he never gave up trying. So he continued to take the book and try to publish it as this collection of letters. I moved on to some other things and came back to it at one point about 15 years later, relatively early in my career, and found my stuff absolutely unreadable at that time, and it was. But thought his was very good, and had the opportunity to talk with him about it further. And we even talked a little bit about renewing the correspondence and continuing it in current day. And he kept saying, we really ought to try to get this thing published. And I was thinking, it's really not very good. At least half of it's awful. The rest of it's great. So unfortunately, it's one of those things that I had resolved to do, and it never quite got done.
Sure.
And after his death, and actually he had the manuscript in his hospice room when he passed.
Oh.
And so after his death, I said, if there's one thing I'm going to do, I'm going to get this thing published. And so I went to it and did what you have to do with something that is half really good and half really terrible. I took that terrible half out and tried to connect his letters and left them as they were pretty much, but tried to connect them with more of a narrative and a little bit more about his life. It was more of sort of a biographical piece.
You bet.
But still left some of, I cheated and made my stuff look a little better. I did leave a little bit of stuff for me, so it still looked like an exchange of letters in it. And at that point, was introduced to someone at Lilly Endowment. I work a lot with people at Lilly Endowment, but I had not known Craig Dykstra before that, on the religion side of the endowment at all. And this is before we were members of this church. And Craig is, of course, one of the best human beings there is. And he had lunch with me up there one day, and I showed him my collection, and he actually read it, which was really kind of him. And he called me to come back and have lunch with him a couple weeks later and said, this is a really nice collection of letters. And he said, as a family document, it's really good, and you ought to feel good about it. You cleaned up your stuff, and his stuff is really good. But it's not a book. It's a collection of really good family letters. He said, I know what a book looks like. And if you are interested, I can tell you how to make this a book, but it's going to be a lot of work. And I said, well, how much work? And he said, well, you need to go back and produce. And he said it needs to be about you, because you're here and he's not, and so you need to. He said, I hate to break this to you, but you're actually older than he was when he wrote these letters to you. So it's sort of
you're wise.
It kind of begs the question of how what you learn, right? And he said it's such an obvious question that's the one you got to use. So he said, you need to take those letters into your own life and make it a memoir that is clearly very informed with his voice. Yeah. And he said it's not going to be easy to do, but he said you got an awful lot of really good material here to work with. And I said, well, I'll work on that. I'll bring you back a chapter. He said, no, I won't read a chapter. He said, anyone can write one chapter. 2 chapters I will read. So you got to do 2.
He's worked with writers before. It sounds like.
He has. So he really understood what was involved in that. So I I did do that. And he was incredibly helpful. He's very dear friends with Tom Long at Emory University, who's also spoken here in the past. The two of them are very, very close. And Tom's published a couple of books in his time too. And Tom got interested in the project. And so I could not have had better mentors in this effort. And they both ended up reading it and giving me some thoughts. And then wonderfully said, you know, you ought to think about getting this published.
Yeah.
And where would you like to go? And I said, well, and they mentioned 2 or 3 different publishers. I said, look, we're so far ahead of where I ever thought this thing would get that any of that would work out. But I said, if it could be published by Eerdmans, that would mean a great deal to my dad, because that was always the publisher that he really identified with.
Was it? Okay.
In Grand Rapids.
Yeah.
And so Craig Dykstra wrote a very lovely introduction. This is how stuff gets done. Letter from me to John Pott, who was the editor up there at the time, and I didn't hear from John Pott for months. And so I thought, well, I don't like it. And I finally wrote to him and said, you know, should I send you a stamp and you can send me the thing back? And he said, no, we're going to publish it. So I was like, okay. Who knew? So yeah, it ended up really being remarkably. It was a very pleasant process at the end. It was the Eerdmans folks were fun to work with, and again, Craig was just a tremendous friend throughout the whole thing. And
Yeah. And those of you who were here for Bill Enright may recognize the names that David mentioned. Tom Long and Craig Dykstra were both significant for Bill's publication too. So there's a little bit of there's a team here of people who help aspiring writers, or people who don't think they're writers until they're encouraged to move in that direction. You mentioned the hospice in the case of your dad, and you have this great little back and forth in here about hospice Christians and hospital Christians, and how your mom, I think, was her last days were in the hospital. And that was a very hard place for you. And that the hospice was a little bit easier place for you, and yet you end up siding with the hospital Christians. Tell the group here assembled how that relates to your last days with your parents, and what you mean by the difference between hospice Christians and hospital.
Well, certainly my father's death was in the end what gave me the theological courage, I think, to write this, because watching how he dealt with that and watching how he faced it, and spending lots of time with him in that process, and frankly seeing he really believed it. I mean, it was sort of like it was all right there, and watching him come to terms with it, not gentle terms, but terms, was the kind of an inspirational lesson, and frankly a very simple lesson, but profound in faith, that I could never have imagined. So from that standpoint, the fact he was in hospice was great, because it gave us a lot of time together and a lot of time to talk. And
Absolutely.
So I didn't mean the comment in the book to be critical of that. It was really a metaphor for the fact that his death was very sudden. It was so sudden, his cancer was so advanced, that there was literally nothing he could do except be confined to hospice. And because he came to terms with it early, and there really wasn't any medication he could take, he was pretty much with it until the very end, and it was a really tremendous period of time with him. My mother had congestive heart failure. Her life came to an end on a far more slow and difficult process. And a process that all of us can identify with, because she didn't have one doctor. She had 15 doctors, and they didn't all talk to each other, and you end up in the hospital, and I mean, everybody knows the story. And so dealing with her end-of-life experience, which happened 4 years after my dad's death, was just horrible. I mean, from the standpoint of the chaos, the environment, there was no time for conversation with her much, and she was not doing terribly well by the time she was at that point. And yet, of the two environments, when you think about the metaphor for life, I think Christians have to come out on the side of the hospital, because even though she had clearly the disease that was going to take her life at some point, it wasn't necessarily going to take her life that day. And so there are always choices. There are always things to do. There are always decisions to make. And I had complete power of attorney over her health at that point. And so therefore there was always still hope. And even though the environment was messy and chaotic, you were still in the game.
Yeah.
And to me, you know, part of Christianity today and part of Christian belief, and something my father felt deeply about, is that so much of modern 21st century religion is so excessively hospice-like, therapeutic, comforting, which is important, and comfort is an important part of faith, but not active, not inspiring people to move, not inspiring people to hope, really, not inspiring people to make choices, but people wanting to be taken care of. Yeah. And that was so antithetical to his belief and to mine. But that's where I came up with the comparison after having gone through both those experiences.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. It was, it was a nice image. I want to remind you, a little station break here. I want to remind you that I'm going to be talking with David a bit longer, but the point of this class is to get you engaged with us, particularly with our visiting speakers. So don't think we're ever forgetting about that. So if you have something that our motto is warm hearts, puzzled hearts. If something warms your heart about what Dave has said about his parents or about his job or whatever, or if something puzzles you, why keep it, and then when we open it up, why get that hand up. And this time, because of our speaker and our camera situation, we can't move the mics. So for your questions, we'll ask you to bear with us and just get up to one of the mics and then speak into them, so that this is on video and you can see it after it's over on the second website. But that's how you'll be recorded. So please just do that when you have your questions, which I hope will be coming shortly. We have 33 minutes left.
All right.
The first chapter, the beginning with belief chapter and leaping into faith, there's 8 lessons in here, maybe 9 if you count something right at the end. The beginning ones have such juicy examples that I want to take you to a couple of them. One of them is that political campaign that you described so in an interesting way. I didn't know you were a political candidate.
Very few did at the time I was a candidate, so that was kind of the problem.
You tried to get the word out there.
Yeah. It was a well-kept secret. Yeah.
And then there was your first swim, your first time diving. Apparently it took some encouragement, but there's a metaphor there too. Tell us a little bit about both of those experiences, because they both relate a bit to your faith as it developed. This is just a wonderful book about faith, and here are two nice examples from your life, and so I'd like to take you back to those two.
Well, they're different, and of the two, in terms of sort of metaphors for belief, I think the swimming one is more apt. I was a sickly, asthmatic, cowardly kid that spent most of my summers when we would go to a lake cottage sitting on a rock and being afraid to jump in the water. And finally was encouraged to do that by my father, by my brother to some extent too, but by my father, and not really believing I was going to survive it, but did. And the point of using that example here is that this is so much of belief in life is what you're given by those who love you. And if you are not given that, then oftentimes it's much harder for people to do. I've had many questions throughout my life as to, like, why does this seem to make sense to you? And I can talk about it, and we endlessly talk about it, and yet it's just something I know to be true from a variety of reasons. But I know in part it's because of the way I was brought into the world and the way that I was, the kind of home that I grew up in, the kind of parents I had, and that relationship, which was special and important and symbolic of the way I think the world works. But other people with other experiences sometimes have a much harder time coming to that.
Even though the words are the same.
The words are the same, but the experiences are different. And I think one of the many challenges with arguments over religion is the fact that people really come to it from such very different experiences and viewpoints. And also, I think some people are more attuned to it than others. I think some people have more of a sense of music for it than other people do.
Absolutely.
So that, you know, to me, it's the idea of someone being arrogant or intolerant or impatient because they believe something and someone else doesn't is a pretty bad thing. I have always felt very fortunate to have been given the opportunity to have the kind of faith and belief that has never really been an issue for me in my entire life.
Yeah.
And again, it's not because I have any particular gift, it's because of the gift I was given.
Yeah. Indeed, there's a, here's your dad talking about why you were willing to jump into these unseen waters. It's kind of a nice quote. You were willing to try it because I told you that you could do it. There was this deeply personal angle involved, and a loving and concerned authority that seemed to make the whole thing possible and reasonable. There was somebody there that you trusted, said, you can do it, you can do it, you know, that stayed with you. And without that person, often, it just isn't, it doesn't catch.
Right. And so that's the difference, that's one difference between belief, which is an active thing, or a way that you look at something, and faith, which is the way you look at someone. And that someone can be your parents, it can be God, it is all those things.
Yeah.
But it's ultimately relationships that govern pretty much everything we do, I think.
So how did your faith take you through, or how did it survive the cauldron of a major defeat in your life that you went into this political campaign with a lot of hope, obviously, and a lot of support?
Well, what I should have done first was, again, listen to my father, who said I was nuts for even thinking about that. And I didn't do that. I think two things. One is I thought I had a vocation for politics.
Yeah.
And soon realized, all apart from losing in a really bad way, I realized I really didn't have a vocation for it, and got into the middle of it. And it's a bad thing to realize you don't have a vocation for running for office.
In the middle of it.
Yeah, I'm thinking about someone like Joe Biden today. You know, who clearly feels he has that, and yet was sort of worried he didn't. You know, that he was going to get into the middle of that race, and it wasn't going to be enough to get him through it. Oh my God, here I am in this, and that kind of happened to me. And it's you have a lot of people depending on you.
Right.
Even if you're going to lose, you're still a party's candidate. You got to deliver. You've asked people for money. You've asked people for support.
Yep.
You're going, yeah, I really just don't. And that was how I felt about that. And so, of course, I really did lose. And then coming out of that, you sort of go, what in the world am I doing here? And having combination of confusion and embarrassment, because it's, you know, another thing about losing an election is it's very public, and you know you have to go and concede on television. It's the last time anyone sees you on television, of course. And it's there's just nothing fun about that part of it. Yeah. It did, by the way, though, teach me how to raise money, and that has vocationally helped me later on.
There you go. It's not entirely true that you don't have a vocation for it.
Exactly.
It's a little bit of a. All right.
But you know, it was really a time to sort of try to go back and figure out what I was going to do going forward. And again, knowing, starting with the basics, knowing that you're loved, knowing that you're important, knowing that what you do matters. And really beginning to think about what that might be in a constructive way. It isn't that I had, and I try to make this point in the book, and I think it's really important to make points like this. I did not have some blinding revelation that, you know, certainly what I'm doing now was not a blinding revelation to me on that, but that I'd be doing X or Y. It was that I had the certainty that I belonged and that I would make something work and make something happen, and could move myself beyond where I was at that point. And I have seen other people, I have seen several people lose elections and never recover from it. So it was, it's a profoundly embarrassing thing to have happen to you. I'll just leave it at
I mean, was someone there? I mean, this is such an important thing to happen. I mean, you have gone through the cauldron of a big public loss, and you're willing to say about it, I realize I didn't have a vocation there. I take it that means something other than I'm not going to win. I think it means, say a little bit more about that. When you realize you didn't have a vocation as a politician or as for this kind of office, it's a kind of an apophatic experience. You realize there's clarity about what's not there, all right?
Yeah, part of this is, and I don't want to distract the conversation unduly on politics. Part of the political process, and we're doing more of this as a community and a country all the time. We are making everything harder to do all the time, and we are exponentially driving it up these days. To get anything done in the political process, starting with getting elected, but then actually trying to do something with it, requires just an inordinate amount of constant energy, pushing, prodding.
Yes.
And oftentimes what you're trying to do is pretty simple and pretty basic, like win an election or pass a bill. But it requires a level of energy and focus and almost self-focus, you know, that I'm the only person that can get this done, I got to do it, to make it. And I found after this election, and by the way, I had some encouragement to do this election by the governor at the time, who wanted someone to run with him on the ticket.
Oh, yeah.
And it was viewed widely that I was basically, no one thought I could win. And I thought I actually could for a while, but no one else did. By the way, you have to believe you can win or you can't raise money, but that's a whole other topic.
Yes.
But most people who I knew when I came out of that said, well, you know, you did that to pay your dues, and now you can, that you've done this and you've done all that, you know, you're first in line to do something else. It won't be a big race necessarily, but you get to do something else. And so it was an active question for me, saying, okay, you know, no one expected me to win this one. Next one they will. So what, what should I do? You know, I just don't know if I'm really willing to do all in for that result. I'm just not sure that it's not even that it's a lot of work. Many things are a lot of work, but it's a particular kind of focus and very narrow focus to try to get one single thing done. It just didn't seem to me to be terribly important in what I wanted to do at that point.
So you could have stayed with it, but you moved out of it because of your sense that the vocation isn't here.
Yeah, I think it's the old fire in the belly people talk about for people in public. It's really true. I mean, you and as frustrated as you get with politicians who seem to be terribly self-absorbed, and you gotta be to be successful in that. You have to think that your election is more important than anything else. Because it has to be for you to win. Usually.
I think there's so much wisdom in this book about calling and about the idea of the fact that ministers, here's a preacher's kid, about the fact that people in robes are significant in the sense that when you look at them, they've got something that everybody's got. And the trick is for most people to find it as a layperson. Not as many people are clergy as are lay. And I think there's a real strong sense in my sense of you, Dave, that there's a sense of vocation pulsing through your life and your various moves here, and you're articulate about it and struggling with it, and it's just such a helpful book to read in that respect, to catch on to the idea not only does every person have a calling, but it's equal in rank. This was one of the big Presbyterian fights. It is just as important, as elevated, as precious to God as the guy in the robe, or the woman in the robe, or the person in the robe. So
good one.
Whatever. And so it's so I commend the book in many ways, and particularly on that one. I think we learn directly from David just hearing him talk, but I think captured in the book is a nice sense of lay ministry, of lay calling. And here you see an early fight to figure out what the vocation, vocatio, calling, what the vocation in his life is. A very talented guy. Why didn't he go into preaching? Well, it didn't quite work. Why didn't he become a politician in the second? Because it didn't quite work, and it's kind of interesting to listen to him account for his movement through life. All right, so we got the first swim out of the way. We got that. All right, now tell me a little bit about science and religion. One of the very nice little runs in here, David, is about what you found out about scientists. Let me read this paragraph quickly. My current job offers a confirmation of something you learned from your father, which was that I think you called it a more modest foundation of what we expect in life. We don't really expect to get a perfect understanding of a particular discipline, a particular job, and certainly not life itself. I'm quoting now, "My father urged me to build on a more modest foundation, to make peace with the notion of believing in a God I can never fully explain, not because God wasn't real, but because people were generally not up to the task of fully understanding him. Over time, I came to see his point. With each passing year, I assemble more evidence." Don't we all? "That, whatever the question, no human approach to it ever seems to do the credible job of finding all the answers. I am increasingly skeptical of often facile coherence of insistent ideology, whether in politics, science, or religion. The result for me is a type of patience." Then you talk about your current job now and scientists you've met. It's really nice little run. "My current job offers a particular confirmation of what your father taught, which is what is flawed is not the substance of the belief, but often the limited perception of the believer. My current job offers a confirmation of this. Frequently over the last years, I've seen my father's wisdom in the field of religion apply equally in biological science, a realm supposedly in conflict with religion, in part because science is assumed to be so systematic and sure. From what I've seen, science is anything but those things, and is instead very much like the rest of us, a work in progress." And here's the great sentence. "Perhaps this is why some of the most humble, thoughtful, and, often, religious people I know are scientists."
Yeah, I mean, it's if you think today of, I mean, again, this was something I had no insight into at all until two things. Until first I started working in an area that was intensely scientific, and secondly was working in it as an investor. So one of the really good things that the BioCrossroads organization has done for 10 years was to set up very early seed stage investment funds. We are often the first money in a very promising technology, long before it becomes a product.
Interesting.
But we are usually the first place a scientist goes to move an idea out of the lab and potentially into later stages or early stages of commercial development.
Oh, interesting.
Where maybe 10 or 15 years later, it can end up becoming a life-saving drug. Every medication that any of you here is taking that is currently patented, in other words, that has a brand name on it, the discovery behind that is at least 15 to 20 years old. So the process that we're looking at for the development of any type of therapeutic product it takes a very long time for a lot of good reasons, actually, because of getting it through the regulatory process, which is helpful because by the time that happens, the drugs actually work and they don't kill you, which is a very important thing to be able to conclude, and the United States is better at that than anybody else. But we are on the real early end of that, and so we're at the end where people are trying to figure out, frankly, whether they're looking at a disease or whether they're looking at a cure. And probably the best example to give the audience here, it's a current one that Eli Lilly and Company's doing. Lilly's on the frontier and maybe on the verge of having a blockbuster drug to treat Alzheimer's. And if it happens, they will have the first drug that's ever treated Alzheimer's, really treated the disease, not just the symptoms. And it will be worth a fortune. And what they've had to do, though, to develop it is nobody really understands what Alzheimer's disease is. And unfortunately, it so affects the brain that it's even hard to see it by the time people really understand that they have it. And so there is a secretion in the brain of everybody who has Alzheimer's called amyloid plaque. It's just like any other kind of plaque. And nobody knows, or no one thought they knew, whether that plaque is the cause of Alzheimer's
Or the result.
or the result.
Yeah.
And every pharmaceutical company in the world is working on trying to answer that question. Some believe it's it. Some believe there's another thing called tau, which is the answer. And there's a third theory out there. And whoever gets this right is going to have, looks like it actually may be the cause. At least that's what the early data on the first promising clinical trials that Lilly's ever had look like. But if you talk to the people working on that at Lilly, or if you talk to a research scientist at the School of Medicine at IU working on that, they're not arrogant about that. They're not confident about it. They think this is what I'm going to try.
Right, right.
But the point is, we are now at a point, cancer is another area, where we don't even really understand what the diseases are, let alone what the cures look like. And if you are not humble in working in that area, as smart as you may think you are, if you're not humble in your ability to look at what you're seeing and do something with it, you cannot have any success. So the people I know who are the most successful scientific entrepreneurs, and there are not many of them, because most people simply fail at doing this, but the ones who succeed have had many failures before they have gotten to success. And it's not linear. Once they start succeeding doesn't mean they're always going to succeed. They can go back to failing again. And usually do. And that, knowing that, understanding that, seeing that, and talking with people about it, because again, they're asking me to put money with these early scientists into, they want $500,000 for this idea that is absolutely unproven, and is it a cause or is it an effect? That's a really engaging, important process. And arrogance and simplicity don't help in that effort, and the people who are successful don't have them. And so the notion that somehow the scientific realm is this certain thing and works on all these principles, whereas religion is this speculative realm that no one really kind of gets how it works, frankly, kind of the same thing.
Do you speak for the atmosphere? Are there lots of humble, careful to make generalization folks that you're running into, or is it still?
You can be, understand this obvious point, but I'll make it. You can appear to be arrogant. I mean, these are very smart people, and they speak very confidently.
That's right.
But in truth, they are not confident. I mean, they don't know. They're working on a theory, they're betting on it, but they don't know. And that is true really in all breakthrough discoveries going forward. And oftentimes, by the way, once somebody makes a breakthrough discovery, they may not still understand how it works. Wow. They may just be able to prove that it does. So that's called mechanism of action in this area. And oftentimes people cannot tell you what it is because they don't know.
Isn't that something?
Human body is a profoundly complicated thing. And the more we learn about it, the less we know about it.
Grand stuff. I want to move on quickly to. I want you to say something maybe about your wife. You use her in such a beautiful way here. You turn to her in a chapter about God's love and the love of God, talking about love from God, and then becoming God's beloved children in the sense of imitating God and loving others the way God loves us. And your wife comes up, and cooking comes up in a very, very wonderful way. You have to read about it. It may embarrass you to say much more about it, but I think it's just a wonderful. And then at the end of that chapter, you talk about the time when you felt closer to God, as close to God as you've ever felt in your life. I think it was while you were at Oxford. It's a nice chapter again about the importance and value and reality of love as you sense it in faith love of God and to God in your life. If you would just say a little bit about that, and then I'll open it up to
That's
the...
quite a long question.
Well, I know. I know.
So let me try to, I appreciate that. Let me try to look at it like this. One of the fundamental things my father believed, and that I really believe too, is that faith and love obviously are on the same side of the fence, and sin is the opposite of faith and the opposite of love. Sin is not a bunch of small acts. It's not forgiveness of sins. It's forgiveness of sin. Which is the relationship that is broken. Yes. And there are many ways you can break the relationship. You can break it in big ways, in big pronunciations and denouncements and turning away, or you can do it in small ways, what he called, and I quoted him in here, the little foxes of all the little petty things that people do to each other that basically are breaking faith with each other and breaking faith with their relationship with God. Yeah. It is the same. It works the same way in love. That love is a profound feeling, a profound affirmation, a profound relationship, but it is carried out and illustrated by doing small, everyday things. Cooking a great meal for somebody, leaving a note for somebody, respecting and wanting to advance that person, affirming that person's importance. Everybody spends most of our lives wondering if someone really cares about us or not. And there are many ways, large but also small, that we need to affirm that. And frankly, that is probably, I think, the way in which we practice Christianity or lapse from the practice of Christianity the most. You talk about profound experiences. I mentioned that in the book only because to me it was unusual, and frankly I don't think it's necessary. I do not believe that people need to have mountaintop moment or a sudden blinding vision, or I profoundly do not believe that. Yeah. But it is true that we do live in all of our lives. There are certain moments where we feel the encounter with something that is not us to be profoundly present. And sometimes that's with someone we love. Sometimes that is in another kind of experience. And I mentioned in the book when I was at Oxford University going to a chapel at a place called Little Gidding, which is really it's a little tiny working chapel on a pig farm in the moors of Yorkshire, where it's the most insignificant place in the world, but it happens to be where Charles II came when he was fleeing, ultimately was executed not far from there when he was fleeing the English Revolution. It has been a center of activity in this absolutely end-of-nowhere part of England for things like that, religious activity and others for a long time. The chapel is a very humble, basic building. This was a very cold and bleak English afternoon. They have many of them, and we were experiencing one of them. And there was just something about that moment of being in that really humble place. It had been a very important place, but was still really basic, and had been there for a very long time, and yet was still providing an essential religious service to somebody coming in and seeking a quiet moment. Right. And there's just something that you go, this is kind of it. That's why we're here. And again, it was a really profound, peaceful connectedness feeling, which is really what all of us are searching for all the time, is whether we're alone or whether we're not. And sometimes we really get affirmation that we're not.
Yeah. It reminded me of a little bit, I think you mentioned quiet as well. There's this word quies in Latin. Merton, Thomas Merton makes a lot of that. He's a monk and had tremendous influence on other kinds of religion, but I think you said it was the quietest moment in your life, or the most still moment, or something like that, right?
Yeah, in retrospect, now it really was quiet.
Just 4 bio crossroads.
That's great. Yep.
I'm taking up too much time here. I'm having too much fun. Do we have questions or comments from the gathered audience? I see some smiling faces. I think you've enjoyed David, but ask him a question or two, or do you have a comment? Yes, Beth.
Okay, I have a question.
Make sure the mic gets you, Beth. Can I get you to stand up?
I have to answer answer any question Beth asks me.
There is no dodging.
Because, well, A, because it's Beth, and B, because she knew my parents extremely well. So.
One very lighthearted question. Have you had a pair of blue jeans on since the campaign?
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
That was a humorous moment.
Yeah.
Anyway, the other question is the drug that you were talking about that might have promise for Alzheimer's. Isn't it also a possibility for Parkinson's?
Probably. Most again, here you get back into solanezumab is the drug.
Yeah.
You get into the amazing facts of modern medicine. When people discover something that works, it usually works for many things. Because it works in a way that no one's figured out before. Prozac, for example, turned out to be a different kind of antidepressant that had other possibilities to it in weight loss and cardiovascular care, and not Prozac itself, but the same sort of class of molecules and development that entered into that. And so part of what happens, one of the reasons that the development of therapeutic medicines is so time-consuming and expensive, you oftentimes don't know if you've got the right candidate that's going to deliver the absolute best result. My wife Ann, we were mentioning a moment ago, was a product leader at Lilly, and in her career, she got to work on taking to market a drug called Strattera, which at the time it was introduced was the first drug for ADHD that was not a stimulant. It worked the same way Prozac worked, by making people sort of slow down, but not speed up. Ritalin works exactly the other way. It was originally a failed backup molecule for Prozac that had not worked as well as Prozac in dealing with depression, and so it got put on the shelf, and then someone said, it might work for this. Let's try it for that. Again, I don't want to oversimplify it, and the people from Lilly would probably shoot me for saying this, but people often really don't know why something works or what else it might work on. And the amount of guesswork in all this is fascinating. There's a process for the guesswork. There's a method to it. And we have a regulatory process for bringing new drugs to market that makes sure you know what you're doing before a drug actually gets introduced out on the market, which is one of the reasons it takes so long. But the process of intellectual discovery is not linear at all, ever.
Don.
Just a point of information for us newcomers. I know nothing about your political direction. What party did you go for, and what was the office, and how long ago was all of that?
Yeah, see, I was hoping you would respect my sanity, and I'm gonna answer your question, and then you're gonna think less of me. But I'll answer your question. So I ran. Are you ready for this? I ran for the United States Senate against Richard Lugar in 2000. I've known Richard Lugar since I was in high school, and worked for him at one point, in fact, when I worked on Capitol Hill for the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. But I was vocationally interested in politics, and the fact of the matter was, when Frank O'Bannon was governor of the state of Indiana, he was a very, very dear friend of my parents and a very, very good friend of mine. I never worked for him, but he was someone who I spent many, many hours with. I encouraged him to run for governor when he did. I thought he was a very decent human being and a person that we really needed to have in public office when he ran. And no one ever expected him to win, and he did. And so when he was in the governor's office, it's interesting, when you're in public life, and you should take pity on people who are politicians, really, because it's a very isolating experience for them. We're talking about being connected. Everybody wants something from you, and of course you want something from them. But your scope of your friendship circle gets narrower and narrower and narrower, because everybody in your life kind of wants something from you. And usually you don't have a lot of genuine sort of non-interested friends. And I was a non-interested friend. So I spent a lot of time with him, and when he got ready to run for re-election in 2000, he was anticipating, he had a very brutal race the first time he ran. He thought it was going to be worse in 2000. And they had a problem, because the top place on a ticket, and you'll see this in the next year, the top place in a presidential year on the ticket, if there's a Senate race going on, it's president, senator, governor. And so he wanted, and there are always, here's another fact just to tuck away, there are always people who want to run and say, hey, I ran for Congress, or I ran for governor, or I ran for mayor, and there's some really scary people who want to do that. And once in a while, you'll see one of them emerge, and they'll get famous and all the rest. But there are some really, really frightening people out there who want to run. And if you are a good, sober, earnest person who has a pretty good shot at being reelected, the last thing in the world you want is for one of those people to be on a ballot whose name comes before you do on the ballot. So the way it worked was we talked a lot about it, and he said, no one's going to know who you are, but at least you're not that guy or that person or that person, and it won't hurt me, and it might help you. You're not going to win, but it might help you to do it. So I did. It was not altruistic. I don't mean to suggest that at all. I was doing it. I was glad to be helpful, but I was doing it to see if I could.
Yes.
We don't have time for me to hobble over here.
We can hear you.
Speak.
We can quote you back.
I wonder if the Lilly drug for Alzheimer's being developed, if it, perchance, only helps 10% of the people with Alzheimer's, will it still be a miracle drug?
Yes. If it helps 1% of people with Alzheimer's, there is nothing that helps people with Alzheimer's today.
Wow.
So a drug that actually retards the course of the disease, again, it not only helps the people that it helps, it proves what the disease is, or at least it proves what an element of the disease is that can then be treated with that therapeutic agent. I mean, again, Alzheimer's is a disease that people didn't know existed until about 25 or 30 years ago, even though it was regularly killing people all the time. So we're talking about that. I mean, it's the same way with cancer. The number of cancer therapeutic drugs that are currently in development is just off the charts. It and Alzheimer's are some of the biggest areas of investment and activity out there, and they're the hardest diseases to even understand what they are and how to deal with them. Is cancer one disease, or is it 500 different diseases? Does it affect organs? Is it systematic? Nobody, again, really knows. And people are betting on different theories and wanting to get one of them right enough that it makes a difference in the life of somebody. There was a drug for breast cancer patients called Herceptin that Roche developed, actually Genentech did a few years back. And it only worked in the case of about 22% of women who have a particular genetic susceptibility. But, it sure beat, for those 22%,
Oh, absolutely.
it was everything. And so the drug ended up becoming hugely successful, and people would try to prescribe it even if you didn't necessarily test positive, and sometimes it would work for people that didn't necessarily test positive. So again, I'm not trying to overemphasize this point, but there is a lot of back and forth and some guesswork in all this.
Anybody else? Yes, good.
Yeah, thank you. I'm fascinated to hear these stories, and I can't wait to look at the book. I wonder if you might, when you were talking about BioCrossroads and a little bit of IT and education and bringing together many different organizations with different perspectives, and you've talked about relationships, and so I wonder if you might touch on connectedness and faith, and do you have any insights there on how you've felt connected, in political office and.
Well, let me answer it this way. The areas that we're talking about for progress here, whether it's in discovery of new medicines or development of new software engineering tools and information technology, the economy that we are in the process of giving birth to here, that everybody is, it's happening all over the world, is increasingly not a place of big companies like Lilly and or big institutions like Indiana University. It's much smaller organizations of people who are coming together for more specific purposes in much smaller companies, and oftentimes not being in just one company or one work situation, but in being in 10 of them over the course of a career, because things are just very, very different. I have a 23-year-old daughter who has zero anticipation of doing the same thing in 3 years that she's doing today. Mine was exactly the opposite when I was her age, and she's right. I mean, that's the right way to look at it. The way that this world works, and particularly the way this world works when it comes to economic opportunity and advancement, is through networks. And that was a concept that when we started, whether it was BioCrossroads or the Central Indiana Corporate Partnership, was really alien here. And it's still alien to many people here. You know, people will think they want to do something different, but they don't really know sort of where to start to do that. When you think about tools like LinkedIn or Facebook, I mean, these are all things that have come into existence in the last decade to try to at least have a formal structure to network people and bring them together. And typically the best opportunities that people find as they make their way through all this, you know, they almost always, they don't come from a web page, they come from the relationships they have with other people. And it's absolutely the connectivity that people have. I mean, I'd mention this in the book. You know what I really do when I invest in a startup company? I invest in people I trust. Because I really can't figure out whether their science is going to make it or not. And I don't know if they can either. But I know if either they've done it before or if they have a certain approach to what they do, it's worth it. That's where you put your money on the person really at the end of the day more than anything else. And again, I think we live increasingly in a time where those are the kinds of decisions that get made. So relationships are more important than ever, even though we may not spend enough time in actively developing them as we should.
David, you've written a very rich and stimulating book here. I want to finish by reading a vignette from close to the end, where you're talking about the typical Presbyterian case of someone who is, most of us this way, we're a little bit shy about when it comes to talking about faith openly. And this is a little vignette about a discussion that David has with a woman about her next job. I think of a young woman a little bit further along in life who asked me to meet with her recently for career advice. Trained as a lawyer, this is someone who had been working in a senior management position, was looking to make a change in professional direction as she and her husband worked together to puzzle through the logistical challenges of dual career families with young children. We discussed a variety of options and also the many ways that people process information and make decisions, including through social networks, web-based research, formal career counseling, and discussions with friends and family. At one point, toward the end of the conversation, she observed, "I'm going through this process every day now, and I think I'm making progress. Certainly I have a lot to consider each night when I pray before I go to bed," end quote. Our conversation neither stopped nor started to turn toward religion at that point. After she made this remark, I had no different view of her sincerity, of her focus, or her approach to the very practical problems she was seeking to sort through. Yet she had told me something about herself that was important without seeming in the least bit strange. She had acknowledged the Christian context for her in making significant life choices. Feeling that familiar discomfort, I mean, David had spoken about this earlier. Feeling that familiar discomfort, I had remained silent on the entire subject. At the end of our conversation, I realized that somehow, while I certainly had more to say that day about career options, she ended up with the better statement about what matters most in life. What an honest description of conversation. A wonderful book, and you're quite a guy, David Johnson. Thank you very much for joining us tonight. And David has said he'll stay a few minutes after to discuss with those of you who want to see him personally. There are 4 books, I think, over there.
There's 2 now.
2 now. Yes.
Sorry, I just had one quick question.
Yeah, sure.
So you mentioned that you have a daughter,
Mhm.
and I know probably going back and seeing these letters that your dad wrote to you and that you responded, I wondered if you had any advice, and if you wrote your daughter, like if you journaled to her, or if you wrote any letters to her that she will read someday, because I'm in that process now with small children and writing things. I'm thinking, is there any advice you can give me on what I should leave out of these journal entries?
You know, that is a great question, and in fact, when this book came out 3 years ago, and Eerdmans typically wants new authors to write a blog post when the book comes out, and mine that I wrote for them was called Learning Without the Letters, and it was on exactly the topic you're talking about. Again, this dates me terribly, but when I was in college, at most you called home once a week, and it was really expensive. And so your best and longest conversations, you wrote them down. I mean, it's just true. And so letters were something that you did, and they weren't unusual. I mean, there was nothing formal or unusual about the fact that my father and I were writing each other, because that's what everybody did.
Yeah.
And then you'd have a phone conversation once a week that would be short. You'd be asking for money, and that all worked. But the real stuff was in the letters you wrote. And I talk to my daughter easily 3 or 4 times a day. We are extremely close. I talk to her extended conversations on the phone. We talk through text. We talk through email. We are connected, and always have been. And she's the same way with her mother. But we do not have longer, more protracted conversations, either in journals or at least nothing that's written down. Some of the texts are getting kind of long, but they can't really do it. And I worry about that, because I think, there is real value. I mean, when I went back and looked at this stuff, and different ages in particular, but when I went back and looked at what my father had sent me, and I was 30 years older than when he'd sent it, I thought, wow, that is really, I had no idea when I got it how good that was. Mm-hmm. And I had to live longer to be able to understand that. And that's the kind of impact you want to be able to have on your children. I think it would be really worth, if you can do it, I think it would be really worth the discipline of setting up, whether it be a journal or a blog or some kind of communication that you do on a fairly regular and disciplined basis. This worked because we decided we really were going to just exchange letters until we'd finished the conversation, and so we did it over the period of about 2 years. And in that sense, it was unusual, but the medium was not. And I think we have to find today, in the new media, other ways to be able to do some of the same things, because otherwise, all this stuff's just going to get kind of lost in snippets.
Yeah. That's a
great question.
Very concern came up last week as well. Vicki.
Well, just following along on that, do you have any feeling about the time frame? You write a letter, it goes through the mail, the person receives it, they have to write, it comes back. There's this pause.
You bet.
With email,
No
there's
pause.
hardly any pausing anymore. And there's all these instant replies, and if you're not reading it as soon as you get the bing, you feel like you have to answer immediately. Do you feel a difference?
Oh, yeah. And you also feel sometimes there ought to be a pause.
Yeah.
There are things you get back where you go, I'll bet if they thought about that for another hour, they wouldn't have sent that. Because interestingly enough, to your point, and really to yours too, as we all know, those emails get preserved forever. They may not be works of art, but they're all there. And what's so interesting to me about the new media communications is people somehow believe that because the medium is less formal and more conversational, that they can say stuff that you would never say in a letter. I mean, there's a discipline of a letter, I think. I don't know if people don't write them anymore, but there's a composition to it that you don't assume when you're doing, a text or an email. And so people then, even some people who really should know better, make the assumption that somehow it's kind of off the record communication, and it's anything, as we all know, it's anything but.
Yeah.
So,
Other comments? All right, again, David,
thank
thank
you.
you
Thanks very
very
much.
much. Great
Appreciate it
to
a lot.
be in conversation
thanks a
with you.
lot. Yeah, you too.